EUCs for 15 years. We've worked in a lot of different industries, a lot of work in supply chain, in retail, food and beverage, high tech, semiconductors, manufacturing, telecom. We also do work in the Big Four and supporting tax platforms with large implementations that use Excel as part of their tax engines for doing compliance and provision in the tax space. More recently, one of our partners brought us into a large bank that's one of their clients, and the thing that we learned from the bank is that we're able to retire the EUC without replatforming it. So in other words, using Boardwalk, we can eliminate the EUC designation from that end user computing or that Excel application, but we don't have to rewrite it onto a new platform. And we're going to explain how we do that. So the key idea with Boardwalk is that we're shifting from files to a database. So as I was describing before, with a lot of these control frameworks, everything's file oriented. So what we're doing with Boardwalk is we're getting the Excel information and the other source information. We're getting that loaded into our unique data store, and we're managing all that data inside of our database or our unique data store, which we'll talk more about. And as a result of that, we're removing that EUC label without the replatforming. We're able to maintain the Excel functional experience for the users. So I'm still able to leverage those local calculations in Excel without having to rewrite those. I can put a collar around that macro so that it's controlled, but it can still operate. And as a result of that, you get very high user adoption and very low impact on the user using this approach. And because of the way we're able to do this with our technology, we're able to retire EUCs up to 70% faster than other approaches that we've been told about. So how do we address it? So if we go back again to the posting pattern example, and you look at this workflow contributor, maker, checker, what we're doing is we are eliminating the data on the desktop. So how are we doing that? Well, we're capturing the data in the Velocity database, but the user can continue to run the processes from Excel with this minimal user disruption. And we're essentially breaking these links. And instead of manually linking these things together the way that they do today, everything now is being pushed and pulled from the Boardwalk server. So if you look at the different components of an EUC migration process, just here doing some comparisons, I've already mentioned the time it takes, I've already mentioned the user impact, but also the flexibility. Oftentimes the reason people build end user computing applications, and especially in Excel, is because it's so flexible. You're quickly able to stand up an application. You want to make changes, you can make changes. So it's very flexible. And then, of course, the cost side of it. The longer it takes, the more it costs, obviously. So Boardwalk really shines compared to a lot of these other methods in the way that we're able to do this in 2 to 3 weeks for a complex EUC. So let me kind of walk through how does it actually work? What are some of the components of this platform? So we take an Excel model, and what we do is we absorb that Excel model into our unique data store. Now I say absorb it for a reason. We absorb it because normally, if I was to take an Excel model and try to put it in a database, I would have to write a build a data model, right? I'd have to design a data structure that understands what the Excel model means. And we don't have to do that. So we have a unique data store. It's a positional data model. Think of it as a grid that knows about positionality of cells, rows, and columns. And so we're able to absorb that model, load it into the Boardwalk database without writing a line of code. So that's step one, makes it much easier for us to get it off the ground than it is for these other platforms where they have to do extensive analysis and then design of a database. Then what we're able to do is we're able to use Excel in a secure browser mode. So what do we mean by that? So as we referenced earlier, the issue is data at rest on the desktop. Well, if I'm using Excel, don't I have the data on the desktop? Well, with Boardwalk, you don't. You have the option of using that Excel application like a browser. So the way it works is with Boardwalk is now I would go to a portal, I would find the Excel templates that I'm allowed to work with. Think of it like a gold copy master template. I download that template. It's an empty shell file. It says, who are you? What can you do? You authenticate. It knows what you're allowed to do, and you download the data into memory, and you work on that data. You do what you need to do for the EUC processing, for this application, for this process. And then once you're finished and you submit your changes back to the Boardwalk data store, all the changes are captured and everything is wiped off your desktop. The file is deleted and there's no remnants of that left on your desktop. You can't email it, you can't save it, there's nothing you can do to it. So as a result of that, because we're using this secure Excel browser mode, you get extremely high user adoption. Because again, you're not, we've heard stories of, users being extremely unhappy because they're spending all this time with a vendor who's saying, well, I need to understand your process because I'm going to rewrite it. So, we need requirements meetings. You got to explain this to me. How does this macro work? So we're avoiding that. And then we use our integration engine. We have an integration engine, ETL capability that allows us to pull data from other sources, as you saw in the picture originally. We're able to use that to pull data in from these different sources into the Boardwalk data store, which we call the Boardwalk digital ledger. We call it a digital ledger because one of the unique things about it is that we're storing data through time. So it's a time-based data environment. So the combination of these things deliver on the no data at rest option on the desktop. And then as I was mentioning, because we're a time-based data store, we have auditability built in and analytics. So I know everything that happens with the Excel models that are running on Boardwalk. Who changed it? What did they change? When did they change it? Formula guide. If somebody was able to change a formula, I would know the formula was changed because I have that built in without writing any code at all. That's all built in because of the way we store the data through time. And as a result of all this, you get much better compliance. And now all the data is actually in a database. So you can now do all kinds of things that you couldn't do before with that data. And so as a result, you get 70%, up to 70% faster remediation of that EUC, and with much higher user adoption and with really excellent data governance because now all the data is in a database. So now I'm going to turn this over to Dharmesh, who will walk you through a demonstration of what we're talking about.
Thanks, Glenn. So today's demo, what we're going to do is we're going to walk you through a contributor maker checker process. And I would like to come back to this slide to explain how the demo is going to work. But before that, I would like you to look at a preview of what an EUC sort of looks like, and how does it, what is the before state, and then when you look at the demo, you understand the after state and how we can transform and mitigate the risk associated with an EUC. So this is an example of the netting process, which is a typical process inside a bank or in a financial institution, where there's a group of people, let's call them the contributors, who are taking some clearinghouse transactions and running it through an Excel process to figure out daily netting. And the criticality of the process is such that it eventually goes and updates the financial ledger of the bank and updates the day-to-day cash positive, negative nettings in the ledger, right? So it's a very critical process. And once you look at the process, you will understand the risk associated with it. So here, the contributor, which could be a group of people again, take a set of clearinghouse transactions, and they allow for a particular month. So this is a monthly process. They line it up into a sheet. Then they would typically have some macros here, which would help them analyze the data. They would add extra, columns at the end of it, which could be formulas, for example, to the data set. So you can all the way see right now that how they took the data from a system, they added some custom columns to it, some manually edited formulas into it. Then they typically would create a pivot against it. So they would say, what are the day-to-day settlement amounts for each of the days? And you can see that not all days are covered if there was no transaction on that day. So it's simply a day-by-day cash flow positive and negative netting, right? Then they would take this data, copy paste it into another sheet, and you can see that they pasted the data here. They manually entered the months, the days of the month, and they figured out the day-to-day netting cash flow, for that month. Then they would summarize it again using a formula into another structure, and something that they would then email again to a person who's a maker, who's going to take this data and create the final update in the ledger. So you can see here already as a contributor, I exported the data manually, I added columns to it, I manually aggregated the data on a pivot, I copy pasted the data in my sheets, and I created many, many situations where not only do I have data on the desktop, but also have created risk situations around EUC. So once I email this data to the maker would then copy paste the data into one new tab. So there's one more copy paste happening. They would take the existing state of the ledger, which is the current state. They would download the FX rate, and then they would create, in this case, some manual pivots against the data, right? So they would aggregate the data by GL accounts and so forth. And then they would try to summarize that data set into another model where they calculate payable, receivable by GL accounts. Then they would manually again copy paste all the data into an output file, which is the final entries they would like to make in the ledger. Then they would again dump it into another output file before they send it to a checker who's going to look at the data, approve it, and then they would manually update it in the target system. So this is the before state, and the risks are pretty evident, to anybody who's aware of Excel risks. And also alongside data at rest, there are issues of errors which could result in high regulatory issues. You would have to revise the financial reporting if you did this wrong, or you used a wrong input file, for example, to do the processing. All kinds of challenges are at hand, right? So how does Boardwalk transform a process like this? So one would simply take an existing EUC, a model like this, and then you would simply share this into the Boardwalk Velocity platform. Once you do this, a database mirror of this information is created inside the Velocity platform. So there's an exact mirror of this data in the grid that Glenn explained in the Boardwalk Velocity data management environment. And the way we transform the process is in this way. So if you come back to the slides for a second. So what would happen now is that rather than the contributor working with the data set from an external system, they would open the work template, they would go to a portal, they would download the Boardwalk Excel browser, they would do the work, they would save the data to the ledger. and then deliver that information through the Velocity platform to a maker, for example, who's working in their own Excel environment. Any other system input that would be coming in from it, a source system like the financial ledger, would also show up inside the Velocity data store and be delivered to a maker, for example. So you can see here in these first few steps, we avoided the email between these two users. We avoided manual download of data from other systems. We delivered the data to the local Excel browser environment, in which the user is working. And once the user is done manipulating the data with a macro or a formula, they would again save the data back to the ledger and send it to the checker. Once the maker is done, this Excel files which are working in Excel memory would disappear, and no data imprint would be left on the user desktop. After the data is sent to the Boardwalk Velocity data store, then they would be delivered to the checker, who would verify everything. And once they approve it, whatever is stored in the ledger, not what is on the user desktop, what is approved and stored in the ledger would be sent to the target system. So you can see here that while preserving the user experience around Excel, we are able to remove all the risk associated with Excel EUCs by having them communicate and store information to the Velocity data store and to connect to other systems using the Boardwalk ETL engine. And you can see that these are really three-dimensional shapes. And what does that mean? It means that alongside the initial data set that is stored, any changes to the data over time is also captured. As a result, you get full auditability and analytics around the whole process in terms of data lineage, a compliance report, an audit report, a risk report in terms of what has changed and what is changed by a larger percentage, or whether the formula changes, and so on. So let's see this whole demo in action, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to a portal. So a user, in this case, the contributor who is starting this process, would go to a portal, for example, something like this, and they would log in. And instead of opening the file on the local Excel desktop, they would see a series of options. What were previously manual, error-prone EUCs now have become Velocity applications, which they can work with. So in this case, I can see that I'm supposed to be working on the clearinghouse process, and this is the gold copy, the master copy of the file, and its version number is mentioned. So I'm not going to make a mistake and use an older version, for example, and everything is SDLC controlled. So I'm going to click on download, which is going to fetch the gold copy of this particular process in my local Excel environment. So once that opens up, and you can see that it breathes and looks, and it's like Excel because it is Excel. So the user does not have any change or any impact into their day-to-day processing, right? So let me open that. So once it opens it up in Excel, you can see that it is basically called as a gold copy of this particular Excel file. Just take a second. So once this opens up, and this can work with any Office Excel version from 2017 all the way to the Office 365, the current version of Excel. So when I enable editing on this, it converts it from a gold copy into a user copy, meaning it's authenticated for this user. And now, instead of opening files manually, I would simply click on data download, and it would go and fetch the latest information from the Velocity data store. Now, in the before state, if you remember, I said that this process is a monthly process, meaning everybody would have a folder on SharePoint or a shared OneDrive for every month that they ran the process. In the new transformed state with Velocity, you would simply go and access an older monthly data set here and simply fetch it onto your local Excel environment. You don't have to go and find the files on SharePoint, for example, to look for older data set or understand and audit older data sets. All the data set is available at your beck and call directly from within Excel. So for this particular month, I'm going to start a new app run for this particular user. And what it is going to do is it's going to simulate the process of fetching the data from the clearinghouse database, and it is going to do certain data manipulations on the server in terms of creating the final monthly netting AR data set as the user did in the local Excel environment. So I'm going to fetch this app run to see if there's a new app run created for the latest month that we are in, which is September 2021. And as you can see that a new month has been created. And once I select it, you can also see there's a workflow now started, which is working through the contributor maker checker to go through this particular EUC process. So I'm going to go and fetch the data for this particular EUC into my local Excel workbook. And based on my role now, a certain data set is brought into my local Excel environment. So you can see here that the clearinghouse transactions have been brought in, they've been marked with the right month, and automatically it has assigned the formulas to it. It has given me certain areas to edit, but it is not allowing me to change the transactional data set. So you can apply access control on a sheet, on a row, or a column as to who can see what, who can do what, for example, with the data set. So for example, a contributor by mistake or by malintent cannot change the source data set. Now, if you remember in the previous state, the contributor used to aggregate the data into a pivot and then copy paste it and then figure out monthly netting AR set. We have capabilities on the server side which can automatically build the data set for you, the aggregated data set. So user does not have to copy paste, does not have to manually create pivots or refer to data from pivots, which is extremely error prone. All that can be automated in the backend. And only thing they can do is they can change whatever they're allowed to edit. For example, I can say this is fine, and they can make multiple changes to it. And rather than emailing the file to anybody else, you simply hit the submit button, which is the only training that you have to give to the user because existing data and the models are all preserved. The only thing they have to retrain in their mind is rather than saving the file on the desktop or emailing to somebody, I simply hit submit. So I can come in and say, this is fine, or I changed, I would like you to look at it, for example. I can make multiple edits as much as my heart pleases, whatever I can change, and I can keep saving my changes to the Boardwalk velocity data store. Remember, Glenn said that this is a time-based store. That means it captures all changes made by users at a cell level over a period of time. So if I click on this cell, I can see cell history of that cell. I can check it if it's this week, last month, last year. I can go back as much as I want and look at that history. So if I click on past week, it will now show me that I've created 2 entries into the data store. Once I created 828 and I changed it to a new value recently, right? So all that history is captured in the ledger at a fine grain level. So auditability and compliance reports and data lineage reports are out of the box that you can directly see. So after I'm done with all of these changes, I will be ready to send it to the maker, who can then take this data further into the process. So I'm going to click on approve for netting. You can see here that right now it is not approved, and this data set would not be visible to the maker. And once I click for approve for netting, then the system would generate an email notification and invite the maker to come into the process and start manipulating the data further, right? So it is now taking all my latest changes and saving it to the ledger and freezing this data set so no further changes can be made to this information. And as you can see, an email has been sent to the maker, for example. Now, one other point I would like your attention to is that this is all working in the Excel memory. It works like a browser. If you remember, I logged in, I fetched the data, it works, brought the data into the Excel memory. Then I switched to the Excel mode where I could use the macros and formulas to calculate things, right? But I'm not allowed to save the file onto the local environment. Neither can I share it with other users. So it is all working like a browser, right? And once I'm done with everything and I close this file, it then wipes out this data from the Excel memory and removes any footprint, if so, on the user desktop. So I can go back to the previous state just like I would if I had logged in using a browser, I worked on it in the browser, and I close the browser, then it is done, right? It works like an Excel browser mode as Glenn was explaining it. And now, as you can see here, is that I can simply, once I sign out, the complete idea of running this EUC is gone from my user desktop. So I logged in, I opened the Excel browser, I worked on it, I finished my job, I moved on. So I'm going to now switch to the maker, who is going to be the next person in the process. And what would have happened is that maker would have received an email, for example, like this, which said it is approved for netting, and it's now your job to take the next step in the process. So the maker would come in, and you can see that the maker has access to a certain set of EUCs. Now I'm going to download the maker gold copy for this, and it will fetch the latest approved template from the server for me to work with, right? So as I open this into my local Excel environment, you can see that different roles in the process can have different access and abilities to manipulate the information, right? So the contributor had access to 2 or 3 tabs where they had a clearing house data, and but the maker, as we saw from the previous state, has access to the financial ledger data set and the FX rate and other things that they can work with. So I'm gonna open and download the data for the maker. And just like the checker, they will have access to the previous app runs and also the latest app run into the local environment. So once we see that tab, I will take you to it. And you can see here that as I switch to the September 2021 run, they also have a view into the workflow. So now they can see where it sits. They can reassign the workflow to somebody else. If the checker is not available on vacation, they can assign a new checker. All that can be done directly within Excel. So once I select a particular app run here, I'm going to simply go and get the data for it. And it downloads not only the final approved netting that the contributor submitted, but other information sets, which like the financial dump, the FX rate, that I'm supposed to work with as a maker, right? So it is fetching all the data set for me. And you can see it's a larger file. So depending on the role, you can selectively assemble an information set that is relevant to that role. So you can simply now think of Excel as a browser, as a container in which you can bring the data set you are supposed to work with. So you can see here that I got the clearinghouse data set. I also got the APAR data set, for example, with the latest values. I would always be working with the latest information that the contributor has submitted, not work on an older file by mistake. I would also see the FX rate. I would also see the latest, the financial dump, for example, from the ledger. I would also see automated, for example, if you remember in the previous state, there were 2 pivots the user used to create. All those are automatically created for you. The data set is ready. And also the previous Excel model is preserved. So we have the model where it looks and feels exactly the same as before, so no change management, and the formulas are preserved. But these are all SDLC controls. Only a subject matter expert can change it. I cannot simply come in and change some formula here. I can use the formula engine, but I can't change it, for example. Now, it also has prepared the line outputs. There are certain columns I'm allowed to edit, and I would be allowed to change it, for example. The green columns I'm allowed to change. In that case, that can be allowed and editable for the user. So if I'm happy with everything, I would go and generate the output file, which is currently empty. If I'm not happy with everything, I would collaborate back and forth with the contributor, not by using email, but simply by using submit refresh to get the data ready for the right entry into the ledger. So once I'm ready with all this, I would click on generate output, which would then take all my Excel data set, validate it. You can apply a lot of validation rules on it, and it will save it back to the ledger, and then finally generate an output file, which is now ready to be sent to the maker, to the checker, for example. So you can see here that the manual touch points, copy pasting, emailing, integrating the data from other systems, all that risk has been removed from the whole process, while preserving the Excel experience which the user is used to. So you can let them work within Excel, and now you can see that it has generated the output file, which is ready for somebody to review before it can be sent to the financial system. So I'm going to send this file now to the checker, who can now look at this output and also look at the inputs that came in, verify everything looks fine before they can upload it to the target system. So while we are doing that, you can also see that not only do we remove the risk of the process, but we also improve the efficiency of the process. What could possibly be taking a day or 2 for the user to work through these files and manipulate the data could be now done in minutes and seconds. And with the trust that the data set is right, all the risk is removed, for example. So now I've emailed this data to the checker, and then corresponding emails and notifications are all generated. You can see that there's a notification to the checker saying please go in and download your template so you can work on the data set and send it to the target system. So as a maker now, I'm going to close this, and just like in the previous case, it wipes out all the data set from the Excel memory and clears out any footprint from the user desktop as we switch now to the checker room, right? So let me just log out as a maker, and I'm going to do the final step in the process, which is the checker. And you get the general gist of the flow here. It is simply very easy to use. It reflects existing methods of usage while eliminating the risk associated with it by simply exchanging and sharing the information through the Velocity data store, right? So I'm going to open that within Excel, the checker template, and that is something is the final step in the process. So before we do that, and while we fetch the data, I'll show you one more thing, just to show how the integration aspect of this works when you're ready to send it to the target system. So I'm going to download the data as a checker. And then you can see here that as a checker, I have access to the same workflow as before. And if I select the latest one, you can see that it has moved through the workflow steps, and it is my job now to either approve and reject it before it can be sent to the target system. So I fetched the latest data set, which is all the data edited by the maker and the final output file, which they've sent for me. So what we're going to do is we're going to simulate a target system in which this data is posted. So we have an FTP folder here called the output folder here, and that has basically no files sitting there at this point, right? And I'm going to try to push a file there, simulating a target upload into a system, and then we're going to bring it to the webinar folder here for us to look at and see the data set that is finally being prepared for us. So here you can see that now all the data set is now brought in alongside the output file. I can review it, I can check the history of it, I can check the compliance reporting around it. And once I'm ready with it, I can simply click on upload to send it to the target system. Now it is telling me that I got to approve it before I can upload it to the target system, meaning all the checks and balances are in place for the user so that they can't make a mistake while working through this process. So I'm going to first approve it. So my approval is registered in the ledger. So there's a complete audit history of the data set. And one can go and recreate the data set as of any time. So an auditor can come in and say, what happened today at 9:23 or 9:23 at 8:40 a.m. They can recreate the data set as of that time and understand what exactly I did on that day. So the notifications are sent out, and I finally click on upload, which then takes this information and pushes it to the target environment in which the data is exported. So you can see that the file export is done, and I'm going to come back to this here, and we're going to refresh it, and you can see that a new file has been created, which is the netting file, which is the final output that is to be sent to the target system. I'm going to now import that file into this local folder, and I'm going to open that folder. And you can see that this file is now here. And if I open that file, you can see that this says the target output file in this respective format, all created using our rule-based integration engine. So you can see that from the before state to the after state, how the process has been transformed. All the risk has been removed while maintaining high user adoption, because we still use Excel, without replatforming everything. So we're preserving the formulas, we're preserving the macros, but removing the EUC designation and converting into a technology application on the server. So this completes our demo. Please share any questions that you might have, and we'll be happy to answer it. So an example EUC, like the one that I've shown you, which has 8 integration inputs, 1 human input, a contributor maker checker process with multiple macros with 4 output files, we were able to transform within 1.5 weeks with this approach, which is extremely fast. I would say about 70 to 80% better than most other approaches that you might have within the technology landscape, right? And Glenn, would you like to cover this?
Yeah. So I mean, I thank you, Dharmesh. I think one of the key aspects that we want to emphasize is that, you know, prior to transforming this with Boardwalk, you're manipulating files. All the information is in files or in emails. It's very hard to know what's there. So not only are the files at risk, but, you know, from a compliance or a data governance perspective, you don't know really what's in there, and you can't. It's not easy to, you know, put your arms around that. And so with Boardwalk, not only are you transforming the process, you're getting the data at rest on the desktop, off the table, but now you've got all the information actually in a database. So now you can do all kinds of things that you couldn't do before, right? You can do monitoring of personal data. You can put alerts or watches on cells. If, you know, if something changes by a certain amount, then, you know, create a notification. You know, look for data violations of other types. You can search across EUCs. So you can create data environments where you can search across all this data and find correlations and interesting things that's happening with this data. You could run machine learning against it. You could use this technique for anti-money laundering kinds of applications. And you've got the ability now to audit the data much more easily than you could before. So, you know, auditors are able to look into the data instead of chasing around files. So just some key points there. So to summarize, and then we'll take some questions. So the first key point is that you're getting into compliance without having to re-platform, and that's key. I mean, what we're seeing is, you know, people start this process in the banks, and once they get going trying to re-platform some of these things, they think they're going to do 1,000 and they do, you know, 30. And it takes a long time, and they go, oh my God, you know, this is not going to scale. We need a different way to do this. And so for people that have a lot of EUCs, this is a great way to get into compliance without replatforming. You get that advantage in time that we talked about, and in cost as a result of that. You get the high user adoption because you're not really changing the process very much for the user, like you would with a lot of these other approaches. You've got the data visibility, you're able to track lineage of the data, and now you've got improved compliance and governance. And you're also driving an increase in process efficiency, and we've seen efficiencies in some processes as much as 75%. So with that, I think that we will take some questions. Dharmesh, do you have some questions there?
Yeah, one of the questions that has come up, Glenn, is how is it different than Office 365 or SharePoint, where I'm able to see the data in the browser, for example? How is it different than that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Why don't you take that one, Dharmesh?
So the main thing to understand is that even though Office 365 is a web-based Excel, you're still working on the shared Excel file. It's not a database. So, for example, you can only work with file level granularity, meaning if I can see the file, I can see the whole file. You cannot say I can see partial data sets by user or role. So there's no segregation of duties. All the manipulation of data from other systems, integration, all that copy pasting and the pivoting and the error-prone formulas that I was using before without any SDLC control are still as they were before. I can still open the data on my desktop, save it locally. So I would violate the data at rest issues, for example. It would be very hard, as we all know, with standard Excel cell history, to create a full data compliance or data lineage or understand what happened with the data set, for example. I would still be dealing with the same challenges of creating multiple folders of files, difficulty understanding as an auditor what exactly happened with my data set. So all the issues associated with Excel are still valid. Instead of just working with a local file, I'm opening the Excel file from the browser, but otherwise nothing much has changed with respect to the risk associated with that EUC. One other question we have, Glenn, is how does it compare to other low-code tools and platforms, which are either BPM oriented or their data pipelines, for example? How does it board velocity's approach compare to that?
Yeah, why don't you take that one, Dharmesh?
So, I mean, one thing that Glenn, you covered, right, in the previous thing is that we have a unique data store. So we have a database technology, which is very different than other approaches, which are simply workflow tools. So they are simply orchestrating a workflow. They're sending an email to the checker, to the maker, to come into the process. And they're really workflow auditing tools. If they limit themselves from simply re-platforming the whole thing. So first approach they might take and say, oh, we'll automate the workflow. Workflow audit is great, but does not remove the risk of the EUC itself. If you want to remove the risk of the EUC, you would have to go through the full three-tier design. You would have to create the database, the class objects, the forms, rewrite the formulas into a new logic, retrain everybody, retest everybody. Even though they might be saying that they can do things quickly, but the time to understand the EUC, to retest it, to retrain everybody is very, very high. So although our development times would be 70 to 80% lower than other approaches, but the training and testing time and understanding the EUC itself would be much, much higher in other approaches that you might use to mitigate EUCs.
Okay.
One last question that we have, Glenn, is...
Actually, there's one more that just came in, Dharmesh.
Okay.
Can this scale to a bank-wide anti-money laundering system like an ERP, or it can only solve reporting aspects to meet regulatory AML requirements? So this is an interesting one. From what we've seen, you know, it looks like a lot of the banks are, the way that they're handling the anti-money laundering is they're pulling transactions out of their big systems, right? I mean, the systems aren't designed to do anti-money laundering. So trying to do that within the system is going to be, you know, kind of a major challenge. And so I think banks are pulling data out of these systems. And naturally, when you're doing you know, data pulls and you want to do analytics against those data pulls, a lot of times you're going to pull that out into Excel, you're going to do manipulations, you're going to reformat, you know, you're going to have analysts who are looking at this and making assessments against the data sets. And so, you know, the answer is yes, you know, we can definitely scale this, because the way they're doing it today in many cases is they're pulling it into manual Excel files. They're limited in what they can handle in terms of the sizes. We have no limitations on the size of the data environment that we can support, because we're running in a, you know, in a database. So although I can view the data in Excel, I don't have any restrictions on the size of the data sets that I'm storing in the database for all this Excel data that you could pull in. So you want to add anything to that, Dharmesh?
Yes, and because it is using standard database technology in the back end, standard IT operations and current methods of managing data center, all that applies to Velocity as it would with anything else. So that's a great advantage. And because it is a database technology, it can scale out to a lot of EUCs and thousands of users. So in our, for example, in our tax environments, we have deployments that generate close to 20 to 30,000 Excel instances from about 600 to 700 different Excel EUCs every year. And all that data is managed from a single data environment for the particular use case. So it can scale out, and this is the fastest way to achieve compliance with respect to the space with the lowest possible cost with the minimum user disruption. Yeah. I think that's all of the questions we have today, Glenn.
No, I think I've got one more that just came in.
Okay.
Do you have a simple user environment that would allow a power user to easily set up an Excel-based process in Velocity? So it's really asking about the tool set. You want to take that one, Dharmesh?
Sure. So we have a series of tools starting from a citizen developer who can use the tool set with very minimal training to create very complex applications, transform them using this in a matter of days. We also have end user citizen tools, which can allow a business end user to take a EUC of reasonable complexity and mitigate that directly on the platform without any IT or technology intervention. And you might find that spectrum. For example, what we find is that of all the high-risk EUCs within a bank, about 90% of them are Excel-oriented. And within that spectrum, you might find a spectrum of 30, 40, 30 or something like that, which are distribution between high, medium, and simple or low complexity EUCs. And one could, between the spectrum of the citizen and the citizen developer, very quickly mitigate this EUCs using the tools and end user experiences that we provide from within Excel.
So another one, so how long would it, so, we showed the demo, so someone's asking, how long would it take to actually do that in another one of these low code platforms? We showed doing it in, in the order of 1.5 to, a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. So our estimation would be that what we finished in 1.5 weeks, it would take other platforms close to 3 to 4 weeks of development. But remember, that alone is just development. You would have to add to that about 1.5 weeks of understanding the requirements, because you now change the whole EUC, rewrote all the formulas and macros. You would have to add another 2 weeks of 3 weeks of testing, because you got to verify everything. Otherwise, the business user is not going to accept it. That means you have to involve them in the whole process. And then at the same time, the team has now retrained the whole end user team to use the new tool, which would take another week or two. So if we add up everything, their overall timeline would be somewhere between 10 to 12 weeks as compared to what we would offer, which would be pretty much 1.5 weeks plus another week or so of training them on the new platform. And because everything is preserved, the users would have a very high confidence that whatever that was working before would continue to work, going forward, right? So that is a big plus. And the team which is transforming would not need to spend days and days asking the end user to document everything, to understand all the nuances of the work, and ensure that all the risk is mitigated. You can also take an approach where you can bring the EUC to a certain level of compliance, and then there is also a rich set of features in the velocity which can add as best practices or other benefits you can derive for the user over a period of time, which also gives something back to the end user. Not only are they getting a risk-free process, but they would also get other benefits from the process, which is in terms of efficiency or other features and capabilities, which can be then delivered to them over a period of time. So it's a win-win for everybody, win for the IT, win for the risk management of the bank or a financial institution, risk for the end user, and a win for the regulatory bodies as well, who are now getting the benefit of high quality data. And in the end, it is also helping with the velocity of information, right? At what speed and at what accuracy is the financial information moving through these banks, and which is where exactly Boardwalk velocity helps mitigate this EUC risk associated with banks today.
Great. A few more here. One is, does Boardwalk use any partners to actually do the implementation of this? Which is actually a great question. So, yeah. So for working with these big banks, we work with different partners. The partners we work with include HCL, Capgemini, Accenture, Infosys. And we've got other relationships with other partners as well. So those are just a few of the partners that we work with to do implementations.
Yeah, and if you have a partner today that you work with today, we can be happy to train them on the platform so that we can bring leverage their experience with your bank or financial institution to help you with this compliance journey.
All right. I'm looking here to see if there's any others that we haven't addressed. Here's one that we haven't addressed. Are there any other ways to view the data that's in the Boardwalk database other than through Excel?
You can also use an Excel interface to do this. You can also bring the data into mobile. There's REST APIs to access the information and work on it. There are multiple ways to sort of do that. So not only you're not limited to Excel in any way. You are able to bring this into any modality within the bank. You can connect it to Tableau, any reporting environment as well to bring the information in.
Great. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you joining the webinar today. And you can reach out to us. My email is there. And we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Have a great rest of your day.